Hello, and welcome to the third in a series of vlogs that I'm doing on the civil unrest, the potential for civil unrest, and ultimately civil war in the United States. As you recall, if you saw the second of these short videos, I was discussing some of the preconditions for civil unrest or civil war in societies throughout the world. And today I'm going to talk about the preconditions or the state of civil unrest or the prospect of civil war in the United States. And I want to give credit to a terrific book by Barbara F. Walter called How Civil Wars Start. If you recall, in the last session, I talked about some of the preconditions that societies around the world have experienced in a run-up to a civil war. One of them was the weakening of the central government, whether it was an authoritarian government or a democratic government. Democratic governments that become weaker and less democratic are more susceptible to civil war, as are totalitarian or authoritarian governments, who are less able to keep control over the population, as we've seen around the world in different places. The other important factor, which I think relates particularly to the United States, is the growth of factionalism within the political parties particularly. And that factionalism can take several forms. It can be based around race. For example, one race predominates or has greater influence in one party. For example, the Republican Party, where specifically white men, dominate in the Congress and Senate, but also in terms of voters as well. Ethnicity is also important. In the United States, native-born white Americans of European descent identify more with the Republican Party, whereas Black, Latino, Asian American minorities identify primarily with the Democratic Party. And this is really factionalism in the sense that by default, if you are a white man, you're probably going to be Republican, just because of the nature of the factionalism. Religion also obviously plays another big role. Christians, church-going Christians, particularly evangelicals, are by and large Republican. More secular are Democrats. So this is all obvious, and we know this is happening. But the idea of factionalism is that it binds you by your ethnic or religious or racial personality characteristic to one party or another. An extreme example of this, but it's actually analogous, would be if I'm a Hutu in an African country and somebody else is a Tutsi. It's not just about their race or ethnicity, it's about their political factions that they're part of. So we are very similar in some ways to that. If you look also at Iraq, if you take a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of factionalism, 5 being the highest level of factionalism, and for example, a complete theocracy would be a highly factionalized, where one religion controls everything, suppresses the other religions. The United States is roughly a 3. 1 out of 5 is a 3, and we're comparable to, say, Iraq, where you have the Sunnis and the Shias going at each other and with power sharing to a certain extent, but highly factionalized or largely factionalized. So factionalization exists in the United States. What are some of the other characteristics that lead to civil unrest or ultimately civil war? A very important one is the loss of privilege. So if you consider that white men have been privileged in the United States since its founding, they have lost their privilege in relation to other groups. For example, women were not able to vote until the early 20th century. Now they are able to vote. There are more civil rights being given to women. And in general, women have gained more rights, to a certain extent more status. And groups of white men have seen this as a loss of their privilege, which it is in a sense. If they're in a privileged position and they need to share that with others, that's a loss. It's also a loss in terms of race. Interesting studies show that most white men don't consider themselves prejudiced and aren't racially prejudiced, but they feel that minority groups, Latino immigrants, Black and other groups are getting more rights than they are. So it's a sort of an inversion of prejudice and discrimination. I'm willing to give people their rights, but I don't want to lose my rights as a result, which is kind of a myth around white privilege. There are other elements of privilege too. Obviously, immigration is an issue because Native American citizens feel that they have a privilege of citizenship, which it is. But that when immigrants come in, illegal immigrants who send their children to school or may have other benefits from living in America, that white citizens or all American citizens are paying some kind of price, so that they're losing because illegal immigrants are in this country, which objectively is not true, since immigrants pay taxes, legal or illegal immigrants pay taxes, and they provide for a healthy workforce. The other would be the urban versus rural distinctions. And rural voters, even though they have some tremendous advantages in terms of representation in institutions like the United States Senate, and they also get undue benefits from federal programs compared to the more populous states or the more urban states, somehow they feel that not only are they losing out in terms of their privilege or their traditional rights, but that also they are being ridiculed, looked down on by urban dwellers. And there's obviously cultural difference between the traditionalists, what some people call sons of the soil in rural areas, and urban dwellers who have a different, more cosmopolitan approach to their life and society and the country in general. What can happen, and I think has begun to happen in the United States, is that these people that we've talked about who feel loss of privilege have also come to the stage, which is the next stage in the development of civil rights unrest, and that is the loss of hope. So the election of Donald Trump was a boost for these groups that felt their loss of privilege. And so there was a certain amount of elation and also a feeling that Trump would be successful in getting rid of the elites, restoring the privilege to those who felt the loss. And then the election of 2020, in which he was defeated, really was a watershed for many of those folks in terms of loss of hope. So elections they're either rigged. We really can't rely on elections anymore to restore the privilege that we feel we've lost. So we're really able to move on to the next stage, which is doing things that are extra legal, including political violence. And interestingly enough, the polls are showing that 1/3 of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, so 1 out of every 3 Americans believe that political violence is justified or somewhat justified in achieving their aims. This is compared to polling just 5 years ago in 2017, which found that only 8% of Americans felt that political violence was justified in terms of meeting their aims. So, what are some of the stages of insurgency as laid out by Barbara Walter, for example, and studies in this field? One is the first stage is where you have a group that has a common set of grievances. They build a collective identity around this narrative or myth, which is pretty much where you see the Republicans now. Their grievances are not policy; their grievances are cultural, and again, it centers on this loss of privilege and the general undermining of traditional American values. And part of this is, as a result of it, if you see, for example, the MAGA Republicans, who represent the sort of the forefront or rear guard, or however you want to call it, of the Republican Party, they are part of this stage is to recruit members. We want more people to come to MAGA, come to rallies, go on the alternate news sites, Truth Social, and to some extent join these groups that are anti-government, even to the extent of being violent. So obviously not all MAGA members are going to sign up for militias, but will be a minority, a significant group who will join active anti-government groups, including militias, which have exploded since the Obama election. And those groups begin training and stockpile weapons and do other things in the run-up to what they see as an inevitable civil war. And then the second stage is sort of random acts of violence. I think you can consider January 6th something like that. It was somewhat, although pre-planned and encouraged by the president, was somewhat spontaneous. But if you go back to the early 1990s, you see events like Oklahoma City bombing and other terrorist acts, which involve violence and death. And the government will respond to these generally. They have responded to them, but they haven't really associated it with a general rise of terrorism or groups that are devoted to guerrilla warfare or civil war. You will often hear the government say, or in the past has said, well, this is a lone wolf. There's just one kind of insane person who decided to blow up a building or assassinate an official or some other, but it's a random act, as they would say, and it's somebody that's just acting alone. That's generally not true. It wasn't even true with Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma. He had some support, and so the government is really trying to downplay this for their own political reasons, but it's really ignoring, as we see in the last few years, it's ignoring what's a serious trend. So certainly the United States is at that point. There's a third stage in the civil war, civil unrest scenario, and that is where you have sustained, organized terrorist attacks and guerrilla warfare. So you'll have militias attacking government buildings, blowing up public facilities, assassinating public officials, essentially an ongoing guerrilla war against the government. And this has not really happened yet. However, that would be the next stage, and so you need to look for the frequency and the organization behind these events. At this point, the government is obviously the FBI, Justice Department, CIA are all more aware of what's going on, and they're looking more closely at right-wing groups. Some of the key elements to look for, indicators of how far we've gotten, is to look to the extent to which the military and the police have been infiltrated by these groups. So the more you find militia members who are active military or veterans, that gets to be a more serious problem, because obviously they have the training and the ability to conduct warfare on this level. And then finally, what are the elements of foreign support? There are many foreign countries who would love to see an active guerrilla war going on in the United States, or an active civil war. And if you see countries who are funding groups, these militia groups that we see, then you know that we have gone to another level of seriousness, because this kind of funding can really help the groups fulfill some of their terrible goals. I guess finally, social media is important as an accelerant. This is just a backdrop that social media will always play a role in amplifying these activities. So that's really, I think, where we are in terms of preconditions. In the next discussion, I'm going to talk about what a civil war or extended civil unrest would look like in the United States. And I will lay out several scenarios, possibilities. These are just imagined scenarios, obviously, but I think they'll give you some insight into how it might look like, and how we might think about our future in terms of civil unrest. So thank you for joining. I look forward to the next conversation.